go. Good. Ciaran, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Ciaran. So yes, I would describe myself as a radical historian, a radical Labour historian. I was studied at Ruskin College, and my form of historical practice is history from below, in the history workshop tradition, focusing on the lived experience of working class people in struggle historically and the relevance of that in the present. So yeah, that's who I am, really. So we'll go through my presentation now on the OTMOOR riots in wider context. A lot of the background research on this way of looking at the OTMOOR riots was done in a monograph, history workshop pamphlet produced by the Ruskin historian Bernard Rini in 1970. The class struggle in 19th century Oxfordshire, a fine history workshop production, and that focused primarily on the campaign itself, and I widen it out from the specific conflict in OTMOOR itself to link it to the general global condition and put it in context in terms of the backstory, and then in terms of the legacies that came out of the riots themselves and the massive nexus of social struggle that the riots were embedded in at that point in 1830. So what was the context? The context was enclosure. That was the basis of the conflict on OTMOOR. And of course, it was a conflict that had been going on for many centuries, but the pace speeded up in the latter part of the 18th century. Of course, after industrial takeoff, that's when enclosure really started galloping across vast swathes of what had previously been common land. But it started from the early modern period. So even at the time of the Peasants' Revolt, it was an issue that was provoking the common people into insurrection. Certainly the case in OTMOOR from 1786 onwards, when the first enclosure bill was proposed. And of course, this is part of Marx's view of primitive accumulation. Enclosure was absolutely key, fundamental part of primitive accumulation, along with colonization, slavery, and modified in the last 40 years, particularly in the work of Silvia Federici, in terms of the attack on women and women's autonomy in society and ability to subsist independently, a process that also had been going on for many hundreds of years. With the enclosure, of course, people are thrown off the land, and in this period, it's linked with the growth of the industrial town and the development of an industrial proletariat who've been thrown off the land due to enclosure. They become the urban proletariat. As David Harvey says, that this actually has continued this form of accumulation. It wasn't something, as Marx suggested, the beginning of capitalism, industrial capitalism, and it was a period that was then superseded. Every time there's a crisis within the capitalist system, there will be a bout of accumulation through dispossession, primitive accumulation, basically rapine and plunder by the wealthy and powerful, appropriating more as a basis for developing the cycle of accumulation. So the direct background was the French Revolutionary Wars, the Revolutionary period, industrial takeoff, a period of immense turmoil. There was squeeze on wages in the countryside, which was then exacerbated when soldiers were demobilized after the French wars ended. You had a really brutal welfare, more like ill-fare system in the countryside, based on the Spiegelman system, which on the surface seemed humane in terms of providing relief to families, based on the price of a loaf of bread. The ratepayers.
Ciaran,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt your flow. Do you want to go to slideshow mode and then we'll see your slides bigger?
Yeah.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
So bottom right, that little projector, that screen symbol. Bottom right.
Oh yeah, got it.
Tiny screen. No, just to the left of that. Left. There's a little screen. Just to the left of the magnifier. To the left of the magnifier.
We're the left of the magnifier. Where are we?
Bottom right. You were there.
Yeah, I could.
You were there, and now left.
I need to get it.
Move left with your mouse. Move left.
Yeah.
There's a tiny screen. That's the one.
Got you.
Click. And just click with your left mouse. Yeah. Click.
Got you.
Click.
Got you.
That's it. Brilliant.
Got you. Wait a minute. How do I? Right. So have you got me now? Yeah. Perfect. Great. Yeah. So sorry about that. I thought I'd got them up for you then, and I'm rattling on. Anyway, yeah. So you've got the growth of the industrial proletariat, growth of industrial towns, the end of the Revolutionary Wars. You've got then severe pressure on wages in the countryside, a very nasty and coercive system, which involved then forced labour under the Spiegelman system in many of the localities. It was being applied, and there was no consistency either. And then you've got the introduction of new machinery, throwing people out of work. And the most explosive example of resistance then is the Luddite uprising from 1811 onwards. And it rumbled through the whole period into the 1820s, starting in Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, were in the lace making industry, frames broken, owners targeted, threatening letters being sent, threatening dire consequences if they didn't refrain from their iniquitous behaviour. And then you had armed bands attacking mills, factories. You had the imposition of martial law. And there was what General Wood said in many of his threatening letters. The aim was to put down all machinery harmful to commonality, harmful to their control over their way of life, their working conditions. They were being forced into the proletarian condition by the introduction of these machines. This entailed a complete overthrow of the previous way of life, the introduction of new types of time discipline and discipline in general, loss of autonomy as well. And as well as that, this is at the same time that they're losing access to the commons as well. Many of these workers who would have allotments and common in rights as well as performing in proto-industrial work. So the Luddites reacted really aggressively. Perhaps the most famous episode was the attack on Rawfolds Mill, with fatalities, and Luddites were executed, transported, is a caricature of Ned, of the leader of the Luddites, semi-drag, carnivalesque type insurrectionary behaviour at that time, direct action. Men would dress as women, women would dress as men. These features then repeated subsequently during the swing uprising later. In 1816, there was a real precursor of what happened during the swing insurrection, when threshing machines had been around since the 1780s and could maybe have been introduced during the Napoleonic Wars, but weren't, because it was realized that it could lead to real social turmoil, as many would be thrown out of work by the threshing machines. In 1816, they were introduced around Ely, leading to riots and the breaking up of those machines. These machines almost caused civil war in East Anglia at the time. Also at this time, of course, we've got the campaign for electoral reform is really pushing forward. You've got the emergence now of, this is the period that E.P. Thompson goes through before the working class is fully consolidated as an industrial proletariat, but you've got a working class movement during this period. You initially had underground unions and organizations. The Luddites, like that, were like an underground militia and trade union in a sense. The Society of the Black Lamp, one of the most organized parts of the Luddite movement. And you had working class radicals like Samuel Bamford, John Bagley, Drummond, the March of the Blanketeers, and it all coalesced into what we see there, image of the Peterloo massacre as the first showing in public of the organized working class movement fighting to change the political system, met with brutal force by the yeomanry, local yeomanry, under the direction of the magistrates, but ultimately under the direction of one of the most repressive governments in British history, really nasty and repressive, and facing really a revolutionary movement that had been rumbling on since the 1790s, the London Corresponding Society. And you had liberation movement in Ireland, the United Irishmen, that had been rumbling on. You had the agitation then for the Catholic emancipation as well during this period. You had the Pentridge Rising, Cato Street conspiracy, where revolutionaries attempted to assassinate the cabinet. And as I said, the wages are depressed. It's a very difficult time, especially in the countryside, where an already demoralized workforce is put under further pressure. Wages are pushed downwards by the flooding of an exploited workforce with all the demobilized soldiers. And yeah, so 1818, and of course, leading up to the end of the 1820s, there was an industrial recession. 1828 and 1829 were disastrous years. There were wet, cold summers, poor harvests, price rises. In a way, the first real crisis of the capitalist system, modern capitalist system, the capitalist cycle, after a growth period. Hence, then there'd been the repeal of the Combination Acts, and the working classes movements could operate more openly. And this agitation carried on through the 1820s until 1828, a collapse in the system, thousands thrown out of the work, mass unemployment, big unrest in the industrial areas, big strikes by the now legal unions. The authorities felt very threatened. And then in July, and this is a European-wide situation, a pre-revolutionary moment, in July the revolution breaks out in Paris, in France. Been brewing right from the beginning of the year, 1830. But simultaneous with this, early instances of swing activity had started in Kent right at the beginning of the year. The swing insurrection itself, which was a massive thing right across the country, started much earlier than, say, Eric Hobsbawm and George Roudet initially thought. Subsequent scholarship has shown that it was much more extensive and started much earlier. The closest point to France, villages started flying the tricolour flag and black flags and red flags. Well, subsequently, afterwards, maybe that's an invention that we'll talk about in a minute as part of this whole flux. In France, the revolution was preceded by something like the swing outburst, massive incendiarism, burning of haystacks, smashing of machinery, the sending of threatening letters, and sabotage. Sounds very familiar in terms of what happened that later here, at the same time, in a sense, right here in England. Then in Belgium, there's a revolution. Just show I'm trying to put the context of what happened in OTMOOR in a global sense, on a global scale, so that we can see that people who lived on OTMOOR and in Oxford at that time, to use E.P. Thompson's phrase, as applied to the Luddites, the vast condescension of posterity, that we don't apply that to them. I mean, my assumption is that they were well aware of all these trends, events that were affecting them personally in radical ways. Move on to the campaign itself. So this is Sir Alexander Croke, who, as a young man, 1786, came up with the first scheme for enclosure of OTMOOR, north of Oxford, approximately 3,600 acres of marshland, been recorded in Domesday Book. The usage of the common, governed by custom since time immemorial. But Alexander Croke, as a young man, was in with a great craze for improving the land, in other words, commodifying the land. Arthur Young and Davis, like great promoters of improving the land and enclosure, both looked at OTMOOR and said, oh, good revenues could be made out of that land. Well, Alexander was the heir to the manor at Horton-cum Studley and a young commoner at Oriel College. And he thought maybe he could become one of the landed gentry, aristocrat, may expand his holdings. He had major commoning rights himself on the common. And he proposed this enclosure bill, brought it before Parliament, initially aided by a local lawyer, Mr. Taunton, who wanted a stake in it. He managed to persuade the Duke of Marlborough and the Oxford colleges they were willing to go along and accommodate young Alexander's plans. At that point, Oriel and Balliol, Oriel and Magdalen, big landowners on the margins of the common who had commoning rights, and along with the aristocrats and the Earl of Abingdon. But the Earl of Abingdon was the overlord of the whole common. He had the Moor Court at Beckley. He was the Lord and Manor at Beckley, and through customary practice claimed overlordship of the soil and game over the common. And he was a radical at that point, a radical aristocrat in the people around Pitt. And so he opposed it. And immediately his lawyer, Mr. Taunton, backed out. And the Earl of Abingdon said that he wanted to represent the commoners, not the rich outsiders living on the margins of the common. And it was defeated. So Alexander gave up his plans, young Alexander at that point, and studied law at Oriel to become an advocate. And he did very well, actually, in his career, and subsequently became a justice in Nova Scotia and kept his holdings. But the local landowners and Mr. Taunton kept trying again and again, and they were determined to try and enclose the land. So looking at what kind of place was OTMOOR itself, and what were the local people going to lose? So OTMOOR was surrounded by seven towns of OTMOOR, 7 villages, and it amounted to a substantial number of people altogether. The biggest village there, you see the central picture there of Charlton on OTMOOR, and then you had Fencott, Murcott, Oddington, Noak, and Horton cum Studley. And from the image there, as you can see, what's the moor like? As you know now, it's very, very wet. It's gloomy. It was always characterized as gloomy, miasmic marshlands. The names Fencott, Splosh. They have pills of like big embankments and hollows. Flits was well known for thick fogs. The cattle that were driven out onto the moors often developed a distemper that the local people called the moor evil. So it didn't look, an ideal place for improvement. But the proprietors also, one of the reasons for enclosure that the prospective proprietors also mentioned was improving the morals of the local people of the 7 towns, because they were quite autonomous. There were no gentry living in the towns, and indeed, you see the church there in Charlton, but there were no resident clergy of the Church of England. They all came out from Oxford. They couldn't settle in the place. The people were quite rebellious. There was a lot of non-conformity in the villages there. And they weren't enclosed. Also, they were still operating with a medieval common open field strip farming system on rotational basis, and the common itself right by them it could be used for all sorts of subsistence. And finally, there was a bill did get through in 1815, and then they were losing quite a lot of things. As I said, the people were described as dissolute, insubordinate, independent. They had an independent means of subsistence. And Charlton itself was kind of semi-industrial. It had a brickworks, it had ostlers, blacksmiths, wheelwrights. There was quarrying going on there, masonry, brickworks, and it also made the Oxford stagecoach. That's where it was made in Charlton. And there was massive resistance coming particularly from Charlton, but from all the villages and people in Charlton as well. And this was cross-class, Bernard Reaney analysed it in terms of class, but it was communal as well. It was cross-class. Then you're getting the richer, more well-off tenants are seeing it's not in their interests, the enclosures. So you had a kind of communal solidarities developing in the village itself as a result of every time an enclosure bill was proposed and the notices were put up on the doors of the churches, they were ripped down. And police special constables had already been tried on the moor and chased off. And the parish constables were useless to deal with the resistance that started almost immediately, because they were just village members and actually engaged in the resistance themselves. So for the prospective proprietors, policing and disciplining these villages was a key thing right from the start of the process. And as E.P. Thompson said, these things were a plain enough case of class robbery instituted in a parliament dominated by landowners, lawyers and elitist clerics. And these were the people who were going to benefit from the enclosure of OTMOOR, while the people were going to lose the rights to get peat to burn, to graze cattle, sheep, pigs, geese, very important, ducking, fishing. It was good for rabbits, fuel, building materials, and the Moor also produced the osiers for the basket weaving, which was the major cottage industry for all the villages around the Moor. So loss of all these rights had lead to the cottagers being reduced to below the subsistence level and becoming totally dependent on wage labour. It may be good for some of the stronger farmers, but they didn't like the overall tenor of it, and an alliance did develop then. And the stronger farmers encouraged the poorer landless rural labourers to start attacking the enclosures as they were being developed. After the 1815 bill, so the large proprietors on the edges carve it all up between them. That's the new Earl of Abingdon. The old radical Earl died, and his new young's an improving laissez-faire, liking aristocrat who's in with the capitalist crew. The Duke of Marlborough, Sir Alexander Croke, now in Nova Scotia, dispensing colonial justice. The local magistrates, the Reverend Theophilus Crook being Cook, that is, and the Reverend Philip Searle, local magistrates, both priests, both the local Church of England vicars, both absentee vicars living in Oxford, but would go out there to enforce the law on the local people. Also, Oriel, Balliol, modelling colleges. So Earl of Abingdon, Alexander Croke, Theophilus Cook, and Philip Searle were to be the commissioners, the main beneficiaries, but also the trustees of the enclosure commissioner. So it's totally corrupt procedure. And the poor cottagers and small farmers lost all rights with no compensation whatsoever. Massive drainage of the common. They altered the course of the River Ray. It was a big capital project, this. A lot of money had to be put into this up front before any prospect of making money in revenues. And they altered the course of the River Ray. In this bad time of 1829, 1830, then, when the bad weather, dearth, and massive flooding then, and the new altered River Ray burst its banks and inundated the common fields of Charlton and some of the other villages. And the people were incensed in the summer of 1829. And they started attacking the embankments and dikes, and they destroyed them to the extent that the river went back to its original course. So these men were then indicted to go to the assizes and were tried by Justice Park later, he was quite a harsh judge of swing rioters and sentenced many to death and transported many others. But on this occasion, he said that the enclosure commissioners had gone beyond their remit and caused a public nuisance by altering the flow of the River A so that effective good agricultural land in the adjoining villages. And they were acquitted. That led to more attacks, rumbling attacks, going on through the coming year. And the people around the common then in the villages thought that this gave them the right then to attack the enclosures, that the enclosures themselves were illegal. So it came to a head the following August, really. The timescales are a bit uncertain looking at the records, but by August 1830, you had large bands of, again, there'd been terrible weather, there'd been flooding of agricultural land, real resentments at the enclosure, and large groups of local people were turning out on the moor with black faces, men dressed up as women, and women were taking part as well. Women dressed up as men. They were highly organized and disciplined, and they'd go out onto the moor at night to go a-cutting, and they'd say the Crown Pub at Charlton was a rallying point for these large groups of saboteurs who'd go out and cut hundreds of yards worth of fencing, destroy hedges, gates, dikes, bridges. Again, the cross-dressing gave it a kind of carnivalesque air, and the using of blackened faces, again, a common technique amongst the labouring poor. Going back to the Waltham Blacks, say, who were poachers encroaching onto royal farm, but they were against enclosure. They were breaking in, saying that this is common land in the 1720s, and that hence the Waltham Black Acts were brought in, which increased the death penalty exponentially across many different offences, really trivial offences. So for a while then, blacking up your face could be a capital offence. But poor people insurrection continued to do this. Be concerted action, blowing of horns to signal to each other. And it was a real problem now for the proprietors. So what do? They bring in police. The Metropolitan Police Force just been formed, an act in the previous year. One of the reasons, I mean, you're given a sort of history in school about the first modern police force, Peel's police force, as it's represented. But it's about protecting property on one side. It's not emphasised enough in the school representation of the modern police force, but also to repress popular disturbances that are becoming uncontainable in this time. And that was one of the key reasons for the institution of the Metropolitan Police. And duty on OTMOOR was one of their first tasks. Metropolitan Police were then recruited to live on the moor. They were chased off. Like some severe battles went on trying to drive the police off the moor. The magistrates also instituted a night watch, but they were really struggling against very large bodies of rebellious Moors people. So serious confrontations followed as the destruction continued in the last week of August. A night watchman was seriously injured, challenging a band. Matters came to a head on Friday, the 3rd of September, 1830, when Wentworth Croke, Sir Alexander Croke's son, challenged a band, destroying fences on his father's so-called property. He drew a pistol and was immediately struck over the head, rendering him unconscious. At that point, the magistrates requested military assistance, and Oxfordshire militia, followed by Churchill's yeomanry, were dispatched, arriving late on Saturday the 4th. Over the weekend, there were no attacks, but handbills were circulating around all the villages in Oxford and Bicester, the surrounding areas, calling for a big turnout on the following Monday, 6th of September, for a demonstration and traditional beating of the bounds. So the 6th then turned out to be the most tumultuous day of this long struggle, which carried on subsequently for years and years. The moor was militarized after this, and troops were stationed then on the moor after this. But on Monday, the 6th of September, 1830, by early morning, there were more than 1,000 people gathered on the moor for a grand repossession in the old custom. Beating the bounds, they perambulated the perimeter of the common and destroyed all obstacles that they came across. Everything in the path before the troops got to them. Every aspect of the enclosure was utterly destroyed and laid open. The troops got there a bit late from Islip. Reverend Cook read the Riot Act. More than 60 people were arrested in the melee. The magistrates picked 44 to be taken to Oxford to be made an example of, the people they viewed as the ringleaders. So they were going to be taken into Oxford in a military cortege from Islip, but unfortunately for the proprietors and the authorities, it was St. Giles Fair. And there was a lot of support. There had been a lot of support for the Moor People's struggle in the local area, linked in as well with the reform struggle as well, parliamentary reform struggle here in the town between Tories and Whigs, now becoming modern Liberals. In the 1820s, there'd been a resolution of a long struggle between the town and the gown, when Liberals, who then subsequently supported the Moors people, forced the university to give up some of its privileges, and in 1825 managed to overcome the humiliating ritual that had been imposed on the town council in terms of total domination by the Chancellor of the university. And they were supporting the Moors people. A rich Liberal in the town, subsequently a town councillor, Richard Smith, set up an account in the bank to collect subscriptions to help the local Moors people in their struggle, and then subsequently in court cases afterwards. So there was a lot of support for them in the town, and people from the Moor got in front of the military cortege and were back in Oxford telling people, distributing the handbills that they'd been putting out before, telling people what had gone on the moor as the cortege approached. There was even a diorama apparently in the carnival, in the fair, of the revolution in France that had been produced by Louis Daguerre, the inventor of photography, famous painter of dioramas, and this one toured the country. And it showed what had happened in Paris in startling detail, according to the Oxford Times at the time, which stirred people up. There were thousands of people, all the workers of Jericho. There was an industrial suburb now in Oxford, in Jericho, that had been developing for the previous 30 years. And there were country labourers, university students, local radicals like William Collins, and particularly John Pusey Sydenham, Welshman, whipping people up, making political speeches there at the time. So it was like now, in a way, it's the only time people from the outlying regions of Oxford come and take possession of that central area. And as it was then, and then they were really wound up politically. Swing stuff had been going on. That was the wider context. That this was now embedded in a generalised insurrection right across, spreading out from Kent. But by this time in September, reaching Oxford and the Midlands and spreading northward, a general uprising about lots of things. Enclosure, in this case, being one of them. As soon as they got to Summertown, they were under attack. So we see St. Giles here. By the time they got to St. Giles, they were under severe attack, and bricks and sticks and brickbats. Beaumont Street was being constructed at that time, so there was a lot of masonry lying about. And as the cortege approached the junction of St. Giles and Beaumont Street, came under massive attack. Welshman was encouraging the crowd to unhorse the buggers, as we recorded in the press at the time, and there was a lot of chanting of OTMOOR forever, and the King of OTMOOR, where's the King of OTMOOR, OTMOOR forever. The soldiers threatened, Captain Hamilton, I think, threatened to open fire and got his soldiers to pull out the swords as if ready for action, and was warned that if there would be no Peterloo in Oxford. And on the corner there of Beaumont Street, they came under such intense pressure that they were routed, completely routed by about 5,000 people. And the military withdrew in disarray, and all of the prisoners were released. And it was a great victory. That was a major defeat then for the proprietors of the enclosure, who then struggled to reimpose order. And even though most of those who escaped did not face justice, some of them did, Welshmen did, but there were no harsh sentences at this point applied to these people. There was a kind of awareness that social harmony, some kind of social peace needed to be restored on the moor, but that also entailed military detachments being billeted on the moor for prolonged periods of time, the introduction of police, the hated police, who could barely survive on the moor at the time, who were there to disrupt any kind of direct action and any kind of protest then against the enclosure of the moor. It rumbled on this battle. I mean, it really didn't die down until after 1835, really. And everything got mixed into a big pre-revolutionary moment. So as this is happening, you've got the swing movement, which, as I said, had been brewing since early summer. We see the kind of thing that was going on OTMOOR. Like, this is images of the Rebecca riots. But again, at the same time in France, as part of the French Revolution, you had les demoiselles of the Ariège, who were doing very similar kinds of direct action, opposition to enclosure of the forests of the Ariège, dressed as women at exactly the same time as this is going on in OTMOOR, in Oxfordshire, and the swing rising is spreading right across England, and also insurrectionary activity spreading right across France, right across Belgium, right across the western part of Germany at that point. As I said, the swing insurrection, the popular etymology, Captain Swing, where does it come from? When gangs are in the field reaping the corn, it would line up, and then someone, the leader of the crew, would shout, "Swing!" and everyone would swing the sickle and cut the wheat. Then that followed by months of threshing work in the barns work that would stretch up until the following May time then, after harvest. So the first outbreaks had been in Kent, in southern England, and yeah, it had spread like wildfire, maybe early April in Kent. So what did they do? They sent threatening letters and they set fire to hayricks, and they destroyed the hideous new threshing machines that were introduced. You've got the two types there. You've got horse-drawn one with a treadmill, and then you've got steam-powered ones. Of course, for the steam, it required a bit of capital to get rid of the workforce. But to make it less labor-intensive and more capital-intensive, you know, it got rid of those fractious labourers, and then there was promise of profits. The map shows how extensive swing actions were right throughout the country. And it developed in all sorts of ways. The destruction of threshing machines, threatening letters, attacking overseers of the poor, workhouses were attacked. There was the destruction of machinery in factories. Overseers of the poor were threatened, kidnapped, kicked out of villages. I'd say one thing about it, even though there were threatening slogans used, bread or blood, said the swing rioters, you know, they were trying to preserve some dignity under extreme attack in severe conditions. And they were generally very non-violent. No one was killed by swing rioters, but 250 of them were sentenced to death, and more than 2,000 were sentenced to transportation, the biggest single incidence of penal transportation in British history. So it's much more extensive than Roudet and Osborne suggest. Raged right across Kent, Essex, Middlesex, Norfolk, Sussex, then Sussex, Hampshire, spreading west and north in Wiltshire, Dorset, Devon, Cornwall, then back up into the home counties, Berkshire and Buckinghamshire, then Wallingford, Oxfordshire, and what happened on OTMOOR and then subsequently in Oxford, then fed into the swing activities that were going on in Oxford, then subsequently in November and December, then in Wycombe, in Benson, around first in Crowmarsh, farmers are warned and their machines are broken. And then in Benson, proprietor from Crowmarsh, Mr. Newton, who wanted to enclose all the common fields around Benson, is threatened with death. His machines are dragged out into the open and destroyed, and fines were imposed then by popular mobs on the farmers. This was an incidence of what E.P. Thompson called the moral economy, was strictly enforced by large groups of insurgent workers who were previously having to live on an unlivable 9 shillings a week or less. They were demanding pay rises, so a lot of it was about pay, also conditions. There was a demand for reform of the political system. In the case, we'll get onto the case. So this incident is what's going on. Over the Rickman, he's been portrayed as a devil, but he's got starving children. They're sending messages to the farmers. This is the kind of thing that you did be sent. This highly imbricated with political issues, parliamentary reform, in full, fair representation, or death to the Prime Minister. I don't know. If you sent a direct death threat now to Boris Johnson, the armed police would be round your house for sure now. It'd be difficult to get away with it, like on the internet or something like that. But Wellington was inundated, and all the local landowners and grandees in every part of the country were threatened. Again, elsewhere in Oxfordshire, in Tadmarton, There was wrecking. Philip Green was arrested, and he was an old soldier, old sailor. He talked about the oppression in the forces and how it was all unequal when he came out, and now the poor must have their way. In High Wycombe, there was a very dangerous attack on the factories of the paper-making factories in High Wycombe across down a 3-mile stretch of the River Thames. I think 4 different factories were attacked by a mob of many hundreds of people. The military would call that a pitched battle, in fact, which came as a result of the introduction of machinery and increased unemployment in the Wycombe area massively. More than 200 paper makers thrown out of work, and they gathered as a big mob outside the town and then subsequently destroyed the machines that had thrown them out of work. And it required military response. So ideas were coalescing then about how to deal with large-scale civil disobedience, insurrection, direct action in terms of police and discipline as well. So that was the situation by the end of 1830. So rick burning, threshing machine breaking, threatening letters, poor law riots, wage riots, food riots, procession and ritual imposition of a moral economy and a moral wage and a moral price. Political riot in Banbury. Banbury was a very dangerous riot took place there. The MP was burned in effigy. Again, it's getting things mixed up involving the terrible paying conditions of rural and urban workers and the political system. The people were putting these things together in their own minds at that point. They were attacking parsons and the church. This is a struggle that had been going on since the Peasants' Revolt. The attack against the appropriation of a significant part of income by the church, tax on the tithe, the refusal to pay the tithes, the game laws as well, along with enclosure. You had the placing of spring guns on land to stop poaching, to stop commoning on enclosed lands, which would maim and kill poor people who were trying to get access to usufruct to live. That was legalized by a liberal government. This is a laissez-faire government then, for kind of neoliberal economic policy. And the whole country is polarizing. Industrial struggles in the north. In Ashton, there's a general strike. 24 pence, what is it? 12 shillings a week or swing, said the mob of factory workers in Ashton on the 3rd of January, 1831. A big mill owner was killed, assassinated at that time. Then in February 1831, the free miners of the Forest Dean, like the OTMOOR people, riot against the enclosure of their areas where they mine on a customary basis. Massive mutiny. The authorities lose control. The unrest spreads into Monmouthshire, culminating in the Merthyr Rising of March 1831. We see an image here of it. This is the most serious industrial uprising that there's ever been up to that point. This is maybe the first time that the red flag has been raised as the symbol of the workers' movement, and it's reputed so. Leader, the mysterious Lewis the Huntsman, executed for his part in it. The authorities and the local industrial magnates, the O'Sheas, totally driven out of the town, and the authorities lost control of Merthyr for more than a week. The military lost pitch battles against the insurgents. All of this is feeding. I mean, the echoes then, people don't forget this. So this is an image of the Chartists then in insurrection, direct physical force Chartists in insurrectionary mode 9 years later. Of course, Frost was the inspired leader of that group. All of this feeds into the agitation, the reform agitation to reform Parliament and the corrupt political system, culminating in the apocalyptic riot in Bristol on the 30th of October, 1831. More than 500 deaths, probably the most serious riot in British history, other than the Gordon riot of 1780. The Mansion House burnt down, the Custom House, the Council House, the Bishop's Palace, all destroyed, absolutely destroyed. So Colston wasn't the first one to fall in Bristol when the common folk had had enough and started voicing out about their resentments. Also, then, late in 1831, cholera hits the country. There's a pandemic, like right across Europe there. I mean, there's revolution in Lyon, that's down at the bottom there. The revolution, the July revolution that's appropriated by the bourgeois isn't enough for the workers of Lyon, who institute a full-scale social revolution. This is at the time that there's cholera in the country, in France, and right across Europe as well. There are cholera riots going on in the country as well. Sir Robert Peel refused to join the government because he thought that there was going to be a civil war and a revolution at the time, unless some sort of reform is passed and the system is made more equitable. I mean, it did finally issue in the so-called Great Reform Bill of 1832, but it was a great betrayal of the mass working class movement that had provided the pressure through swing, through the reform agitation, through industrial unrest, that pushed it through in the end, totally betrayed by the middle classes. So then there's a turn to trade union activity, the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union Cooperation. The word socialism is now being used by Robert Owen and by people in the labour movement. You've got an idea there of the many-headed monster, the Hydra, and there's General Jackson. They're cutting off the heads of all these insurgents. It comes to a crisis in the case of the Tolpuddle martyrs, who were then subsequently transported. Like, not a few number, but what about the 2,000 that had already been transported as a result of taking direct action? The radical historian Roger Ball insisted that there's a big discrepancy between the way that the swing insurrection is represented and the way that the Tolpuddle martyrs are portrayed in labour history. That the swing, a massive thing that almost overthrew the state, is buried because it was about ordinary people taking power into their own hands. Whereas a well-orchestrated campaign that, like the Tolpuddle campaign, and we see the massive demonstration there for the Tolpuddle martyrs, and the first big petition was a direct forerunner of the first Chartist petition that came out then, only a few years later. So the seedbeds of Chartism are now starting to sprout as well in this period. Also in this period, Samuel Sharp. I mean, the convulsions globally, worldwide, like the Sam Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica then, which is what caused ultimately the ending of slavery. that really ferocious apocalyptic insurrection there. This is while ordinary people, ordinary working people in Britain are being sentenced to death for destroying threshing machines and for minor things in the insurrection. Young women like Sarah Bird of Epsom condemned to death for sending a threatening letter to her fiance's employer. Terrible cases like that. Hannah Simmons, a young 16-year-old girl from Shropshire, sentenced to death by a jury including Lord Clive, the son of Clive of India, major property owner, who decided that Hannah Simmons deserved to die because she was part of a mob that attacked her employer's farm, Sir John Forgham, who'd previously assaulted her in public. There's a connection between the repression of these poor English people and slaves in rebellion in the Caribbean, and also colonial conflict in the antipodes. These poor workers, like many poor Irish people who've been enslaved then and thrown out of Ireland and transported to the Caribbean and the Americas as slaves, and then forced to repress others so that Europeans could expropriate and occupy other lands, then going out to Australia, having to fight frontier wars against Aborigines, the Black War in Tasmania, and the massacres at Mile Creek, and the Bathurst War. All these confrontations, these poor people are thrown into direct encounter with poor, oppressed colonial people. What were the legacies of it in terms of direct action? I mean, certainly I've highlighted ecological politics, environmental direct action. That's going back to the battle there for Salisbury Hill there. Pictures taken by my friend Adrian Habib on the ground at the time. A war zone. People taking direct action to defend the land, to defend customary ways of life. Indigenous people doing that. The Zapatistas. I wanted to include the Zapatistas. I've got a picture of Comandante Ramona there on the wall behind me. I'd say they're in direct, a direct constellation, the direct lineage with the farm workers and the rural labourers who took on the landowners and the political establishment in OTMOOR and during the swing insurrection, of a community historically. Violent clashes, millions of Indian farmers refusing the commodification of the land and loss of autonomy over how they want to live. That was like a war. And William Cobbett called it a war, a rural war on the land in 1830. That's what was going on in OTMOOR, a rural war against new forms of police that are coming in, want to discipline social life and produce a commodified world for the benefit of a few and against the interests of many. And it's a matter of life and death, ultimately, when Extinction Rebellion demonstrators are willing to sacrifice their liberty to try and save the planet. You could say that the swing activists were doing the same, fighting against the commodification of the land, like those indigenous people there fighting against the commodification of the land, like the campaign of the Chikpoanilan women in the Himalayas to save the tens of thousands of trees that they did, direct action. Black Lives Matter. Is Black Lives Matter here in Oxford? Remember what it looked like? Well, it's my good friend there, Thatcher Johnson. She's getting better. This is the right to protest about iniquity, We blocked the roads. We brought it to the forefront of people's attention. These are crucial matters, like by being willing to confront the powers that be and take what others view as extreme action to make the world a better place. And certainly we've seen it with CND and peace campaigners. I would include like the people who broke into Bryce Norton dressed up as Mickey Mouse and attacked the aeroplanes. They were followers of Captain Swing and General Ludd in my book too. And the fight over the land and, well, Kill the Bill and repressive measures. We've got Kill the Bill now aimed directly at all this. The bill, the PCSC bill, is a direct response to the actions of Extinction Rebellion and the massive social turbulence caused by Black Lives Matter. And they're trying to repress it, just as the laissez-faire, repressive, liberal and conservative governments in the late 1820s and early 1830s attempted to destroy that popular fury from below. Can it be done? I don't know. I don't know if it can be done. But certainly the battle for OTMOOR is not finished. Even now, people are struggling over OTMOOR. And in the end, the proprietors and improvers and enclosures lost that land after so many attacks by rebellious local people was unviable. It wasn't profitable. It couldn't be improved. It's a wild wetland. It belongs to nature, and people can only live in harmony and adapt to the conditions that there are there. Extractive and dominating capitalism could not make that place a profit-producing commodity. And local people and concerned people still want to safeguard that area. Lewis Carroll used it in Alice Through the Looking Glass as a basis for one of his chapters. The enclosure produced an unusual checkerboard effect on the moor, which Carroll, it's important locally. And era protesters protesting against the expressway. So whether it's a road or whether it's a railway, you know, people are always going to turn out and fight to save OTMOOR. Well, that's the end of my presentation on OTMOOR in a wider context. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Ciaran. Very compelling and dramatic. If you want to unshare your screen, then we can see everyone again.
Yeah, sure thing.
Thanks. And let's, if you're not seeing,
where is it?
Here we go, side by side. You still need to unshare it.
Where am I unsharing it now?
Top middle.
Yeah, I see it.
There's probably something red
unshare.
there.
Unshare, stop share. Got it. Yeah,
That's
there
the
you
one.
go.
Well done. Thank
there you go. It's a while since I've done this shirt, I'm afraid.
No, well
I did
done.
it. I did it 3 times during the lockdown, but that's nearly a year ago now.
No, well done. No, I was absolutely fascinated by the whole thing. We always try to be fair to our speaker and then let them escape at 9 o'clock at the latest. So we've got 15 minutes for questions, and I'm going to start with mine. You never really explained why the cross-dressing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one to explain, I think. It's, again, a customary thing about turning the world upside down. I mean, perhaps it goes back to medieval type kind of carnivals when all social restraints were thrown away and laws of misrule were in place and people wore masks and changed persona. So yeah, it was common and an international phenomenon as well, as I said. So if you compare Les Damoiselles in the Ariège and Rebecca Rioters and Rioters on OTMOOR and swing rioters and Luddites, they're all doing the similar kind of thing, cross-dressing and pretending to be black people.
Right. Is it something that you do?
What, cross-dressing?
Yeah.
I have been known to put on a dress. Yeah, why not?
Dave, you've got your hand raised. You're on mute.
Yeah, I know. I only put my hand up just to say that possibly they'd got the idea from the French. Is that likely?
It's possible, Dave. Yeah, I mean, maybe I should do some more research on that specifically about this specific tendency, because it is very interesting, and to me, it does suggest something about overturning social mores and constraints. You know, and in those days, it would have been really threatening to challenge gender norms in that way, and a way of insulting the powers that be as well. That we can change social mores at will, if we so wish.
I just had one other question, if I'm allowed to ask it now. I'm surprised in your talk you didn't mention the campaign to save OTMOOR from the M40 back in the 70s, 80s.
Yeah. That was
parceled up into little bits, square meter bits, I think, and sold off, so the government couldn't compulsory purchase it.
Yeah. There is so much to talk about there with OTMOOR, Dave. And I have mentioned it before. Every one of these is different because there's so much material that I could cover, because I'm, trying to cover such a wide area. But it was appropriated for military purposes as well. Military installations were set up there, and it was quite an important area, really, in the development of things like radar and ballistics and advanced weaponry, firing ranges there as well. And in the end, the military gave up on those. So, yeah, there's another unfortunate way that the moor was enclosed as well by the powers that be and used for nefarious purposes.
Anyone else for questions?
Yeah, I've got one.
Go ahead, Jenny or Phil.
Really? Sorry, we'll have to change places. Muted.
Jenny, we can't hear you.
Yes, I know. Sorry.
Shush. Go ahead. You need to unmute. Bottom left.
Right.
That's
yeah,
it.
I've done it. Okay. I forgot what the question was now. Oh, this I've known about Captain Swing. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Captain Swing for quite a long time, but at first, of course, I thought it was a real person. And although you've mentioned him or it, could you just say a few more words about who, what, or it Captain Swing was?
Thanks, Jenny. I'm glad you brought that up, because again, I get through so much. It's what to include and what not to include. So an important part, and then again, with OTMOOR, it was a case of this. Outside agitators are coming in, stirring up the people. Now, this is a common trope that was always used. It's like people haven't got their own grievances. It's like some disturbed, evil-minded middle-class person has come in and wound them up. So there were reports of like French people touring the villages, of Kent, etc., stirring up the people there prior to the swing outrages. And you get this in all major lower class uprisings at the time, and it was crucial for the powers that be to identify someone who was swing, and they really thought, a lot of them, that a real swing did exist. So there were lots of rumors. Some said that the real swing was a bloke called Johnny Bonny from Bishop Stortford. Others said that Captain Swing was some mysterious Irish traveller, tinker guy, who went around selling leather products. Others said he was a Welsh fella that lived in London, who was an expert in explosives, who'd been spotted in apothecary shops. Some said that Captain Swing was actually a woman, because there was massive female participation in the uprising. The rick burning was often done in very sophisticated ways, which suggested female participation. There were long woven fuses, woven in very intricate ways. And I said about the women who'd been sentenced to death. So there was a legend that Captain Swing was actually a giant woman, 6 foot tall, who toured the country on a black horse, distributing silver and sweets to children in workhouses and smashing down workhouse doors and liberating poor people, etc. There was even a kind of urban myth that Captain Swing, like Dracula, could only be killed by a silver bullet that had lain in a golden bowl of fresh wheat for 1 year, and that would give it the requisite power to kill Captain Swing. But it was a big thing. Who is Captain Swing? And the authorities engaged in investigations to identify specific individual. And in one case, a magistrate arraigned and really falsely imprisoned a guy and his daughter. One Mary, I can't remember a second. Outrageous example, 11-year-old girl imprisoned for 6 months, and her father, because the suspicious magistrate thought that their family had some information appertaining to the identity of Captain Swing. But of course, Captain Swing, I think as AJP Taylor said, I'll say this, the most formidable popular uprising took place in England in modern times, the revolt of the agricultural labourers. This was the revolt that was led by the legendary Captain Swing. Nobody knows whether he ever existed. All that is known is that he left messages of warning to those farmers or landed gentry who didn't cooperate with the agricultural labourers when they were destroying the threshing machines and demanding just wages. Some time ago, the BBC asked me to give a talk on the man I most admired in history, and I offered to do Captain Swing. I never got a reply, certainly never gave a talk, but Captain Swing is the eponymous popular hero, the representative of the inarticulate masses who is seeking somehow to overthrow this hated system. AJP Taylor, Jenny. So I don't know if that helps.
Ciaran, you mentioned 2,000 people being deported with the Swing riots and 150 being a death sentence. Were these carried out?
250 were sentenced to death.
And were they carried out?
No, in most cases, commuted. But I think about more than 50 people were killed. So were executed. So it was a significant proportion of that. This is a huge thing to have 50 people executed after a major uprising. That's worse than, say, the Easter uprising of 1916 in Ireland. The official response was draconian. It was a horrible. Well, it was a war that went on for years and years and years, and yet thousands transported, thousands. So this is a major incident, not just in British and English history, but in colonial and imperial history as well. In labour history, industrial history, we see now the threat of millions and millions of people being thrown out of work because of technological advances and people's jobs being automized and replaced by robots. This is an ongoing struggle. The Luddites and the people involved in the Swing agitation, are very modern to my eyes. I don't look at them with any condescension. I think they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were trying to fight against the development of a most iniquitous, evil world that was blighting their lives.
Other questions?
Has Dave got a question?
That's Phil.
Phil, go ahead, Pete. You're muted, Pete.
It was fighting against the patriarchal society. So it was a demonstration that it wasn't just, as it were, seemed to be that men were always doing the fight and struggling. And also, I just wondered whether it was the fact of a disguise, that if anybody was witnessing it, they would say that there was this woman, someone who was dressed like green dress or whatever. So I don't know whether that was part of it as well, as a means of throwing people off. Or perhaps it was, you know, sophisticated in the way, sorry, that sounds very condescending, I don't mean it that way, of a patriarchal attribution almost. As most of the, I would imagine most of the owners of the land who wants enclosures were in fact men.
I'd agree. I'd agree, Pete, with all of that. It's probably a bit of everything had been involved in it at one time or another there. It's, I mean, one of the key things about capitalism and, you know, systems of domination and hierarchy generally is they introduced differentials of power, like which destroys solidarity and community of interest between men and women. So sexual politics has always been used to drive a stake into the heart of the working class and organized movements. So the denigration and demeaning of women is harmful then to our possibility to organize effective struggle. And by overthrowing the gender norms that are producing this situation, it's like you say, like challenging it, saying it's like the men saying, yeah, we don't want to be dominant, like, because we're being dominated. We don't want to dominate our women because that makes them doubly dominated when we're already dominated by you. And yeah, definitely an element of disguise in there as well, I'd say. And as well as that, in terms of tactics, there was the notion at the time that the military would not attack so severely women in the front line. And as Peter Lou's an example, in case that the women's groups were pushed right to the front of the marches that coalesced in the centre of Manchester, because there was a hope and a common belief then that the authorities would be less brutal towards women. So yeah, in purely instrumental terms, that was one of the reasons given at the time. And it could apply then also to then cross-dressing as well, perhaps. But women were placed in the front rank and wanted to go in the front rank. So it wasn't just Rebecca rioters were men dressed up as women. There were women dressed up as men there with them, you know, just as there were on OTMOOR during the riots.
200 years later, we get a general secretary of the TUC, so there's a big splash made out of it if a woman is CEO of a company, the first female and all the rest of it. We've not really progressed a great deal. Or if you think of
no,
the bit of race as well,
No.
There's still an undercurrent of white male domination in a lot of phrases and statements about people who rise to power. I mean, the classic story of a woman CEO of a company walks into a meeting, one of the men says, "I'll have a coffee," and all the rest of it, which has happened. And then sit down, and the woman suddenly introduces a woman as this is our CEO, and stupid embarrassment. I could go on. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk, really fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Bye, Sarah. Bye, Sarah. Sarah Lazen be going. Nice to see you, Sarah.
We have reached the witching hour, but Ciaran, you described the Depression of 1830, and then we had the Great Depression in 1930. Your predictions for 2030?
Oh, things aren't looking good. Things aren't looking good. It was essential for these labourers, they felt, to turn the world upside down. Otherwise, catastrophic situation would develop for them, and a catastrophic situation did develop for many of them. And then, because the industrial system, as it was, big expansion then of European imperialism caused by the economic shocks of capitalism, big bouts of primitive accumulation through dispossession and theft. Then, in the majority world, as a result of these, again, social problems in Europe, then caused massive catastrophes elsewhere. And there, the catastrophes were enormous then for people in other parts of the world then, as a result of what had happened in Europe in 1830. And the failure to resolve it in a properly egalitarian and equitable system led to the development of a rapacious capitalist, extractive capitalism that we've still got. We're still coping with the consequences of it now. So yesterday, the UN Secretary General released the report on the catastrophic racing over the edge of the abyss while we've got war going on. We're closer to nuclear war, I feel now, than we were even in the early 80s, when we were paranoid that we could all die any day. Masses of, climate warming gases are now being, fossil fuels are now being expended along with all the munitions. The idea that the world's going to pull together, that seemed to maybe be there in the lockdowns during the pandemic, it's completely gone away. We've got a multipolar world of aggressing, competing powers, a capitalist system out of control, hypocritical leaders who will not take necessary decisions. We've got a really upset young human population right across the planet, coping with a terrifying prospective future, and I'm worried for the future of my kids. And we don't know in a few years what the effects of all these. The UN Secretary General yesterday warned that we may be past one of the at least one of these tipping points with cascading effects. And then what will the effects be socially? We've got fascism on the march as well across continents globally, again, during this period. A mass hysteria, which historically you get during pandemics as well and in their aftermath. So all of these things are pointing to, well, it's less than a minute on the doomsday clock, I think, on the last calculation. I'm sorry, I can't. I'm sorry, Stuart, I can't be like Ciaran, really positive about it. We've got to have hope, and my hope is revolutionary fervor. Yeah, that some people wake up, because change can happen very rapidly, and it's terrifying for the powers that be. But something has got to happen somewhere to challenge this entrenched system of surveillance capitalism now. And what's happening to people in the global south is atrocious. There's no justice in this world, but there are people striving for it. And if there's a success somewhere in the striving for justice, then who knows? I do believe in the domino theory. The American policy planners always believed in it, didn't they? You know, and in terms of radical politics and radical action, it's been proven historically that these things are contagious because people are repressed and want a better world, and in their hearts know that a better world is possible. But
well, thank you, Ciaran. We tried to end on a positive note, so that last sentence was positive enough for us. So thank
hope.
You.
We've got to cling on to hope.
Absolutely, that's exactly right.
Don't we?
Well, Ciaran, thanks again. Really appreciated. And everyone, we can show our appreciation in the normal way. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everybody. You've been a great audience. It's been a real privilege to speak to the Faringdon Peace Group. You're well-known campaigners. Indefatigable.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. I'm going to end the recording and then I'm going to end the Zoom session. And good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers, guys. Bye.